We begin with those rising tensions in the Middle East. Chief Foreign Correspondent Trey Yingst is live for us in Tel Aviv. Trey.
Yeah, John, good afternoon. The United States launched a new round of airstrikes against Iran overnight after the IRGC attacked another oil tanker. According to U.S. Central Command, a variety of different targets were hit, including military surveillance sites, air defense capabilities, communication systems, and mine layers. In response, Iran launched missiles and drones toward Kuwait and Bahrain. This was the second exchange of fire this weekend between the United States and Iran. Vice President J.D. Vance posted to X over the weekend saying Iran signed a ceasefire agreement. We have honored it. If they have disagreements about how the MOU is being applied, they can pick up the phone. But violence will be met with violence. The new military action comes as the situation between Israel and Hezbollah plays out on a separate but parallel track. The Israelis launched new airstrikes against Hezbollah this weekend as Hezbollah continued attacks against Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. Late last week, there was a diplomatic breakthrough in Washington as the Israelis and Lebanese signed a framework agreement aimed at normalizing ties between the two countries and disarming Hezbollah.
These were intense talks, difficult talks, but we arrived at an agreement, the framework agreement, which will allow for the achievement of a full peace agreement between our two countries.
Some progress on those talks between Israel and Lebanon, and questions today if the technical talks between the United States and Iran will move forward following this exchange of fire over the weekend. John?
All right, Trey Yingst reporting live from Tel Aviv. Thank you, Trey. So President Trump is now putting Iran on notice. He warns its regime may not survive if the ceasefire keeps breaking down. He says there might come a point when the U.S. is forced to, quote, complete the job. Alex Hogan is at the White House with the latest. Alex.
Hi, John. So as you mentioned, President Trump taking it one step further following these renewed attacks. He took to Truth Social, writing in part, quote, there may come a point when we are no longer able to be reasonable and will be forced to militarily complete the job that we have successfully started. If that happens, the Islamic Republic of Iran will no longer exist. This week, Iran struck a commercial vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. then carried out strikes in Iran on Friday, the first since the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding. Yesterday, Tehran launched a drone and missile attack targeting Bahrain and Kuwait.
If the Iranian regime thinks for a second that President Trump is going to stand by while Iran continues to attack international shipping without a response, or our bases without a response, they're sadly mistaken. And they saw that loud and clear over the last few nights.
As far as efforts that the U.S. has underway to secure peace in Lebanon, Israel and Lebanon signed a framework of agreement this week. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says there is still a lot of work to be done, although this weekend Hezbollah rejected that framework, calling on Lebanon to abandon the agreement. Today, President Trump visited Lafayette Park next to the White House and spent about 2 hours at the East Potomac Golf Course, both of which the president is trying to renovate, including the golf course there, which is on federal land. President Trump spent part of the day at his own golf course in Virginia, and he's now back here at the White House. John.
Alex Hogan from the White House. Alex, thank you.
Is the president probably frustrated today that they haven't stopped? Yeah, he is. But I think we're doing the right thing. We're going to give them a chance, and if not, we're going to have to continue to bomb them.
Well, the path to Middle East peace once again being tested, with both sides trading strikes over the past 48 hours. Tehran is insisting on complete control over the Strait of Hormuz, contradicting what Iran agreed to in the Memorandum of Understanding. Let's bring in retired U.S. Navy Captain Bob Wells. Captain Wells, you've served in that part of the world. I think you know how the Iranians think. Is it any surprise to you that they're all of a sudden now saying that they get to control the strait?
No, for the past 47 years, Iran has always wanted to be the hegemon and control and to push out American influence. Consequently, what you see now is a combination of not only words by the Iranian foreign minister, but also deeds by the IRGC to continue to pressurize and to complicate this memorandum of understanding. I think the president's right. I think eventually we'll have to finish the job. I think the IRGC itself is like a leopard. And as you know, John, a leopard can't change its spots.
Yeah, well, I wonder who's really in charge in Iran right now. I mean, they make these agreements, but then they violate them, and you wonder if it isn't some lower level staffer or some person who wants to be the next leader of Iran who's issuing orders for strikes that maybe high command doesn't want. What do you think?
I think that's a possibility with regard to the region around the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC surveillance areas wants to control that. But I also look back on the actual character and how the Iranian foreign minister got to where he's at, how the Iranian Speaker of the House got to where he's at, and both of them are IRGC in their pedigree. So I think we need to look at the fact that even though they signed off on the MOU itself, they added some complications with regard to the Lebanon, linkage of Lebanon itself. I still think overall their deeds emphasize the fact that they want to be in charge of the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz still is the focal point with regard to the way ahead.
But other nations are, sort of engineering around the complication of the Strait of Hormuz, building pipelines and that sort of thing.
That's a good thing. I mean, we've seen that with Saudi Arabia. This is a lesson learned from the 1970s and 80s, where they built the Trans-Saudi pipeline into Yanbu. Also, the Emirates building a pipeline over to Fujairah. Also, Iraq, looking at what Iraq's trying to do and possibility of Syria. So there'll be some dynamic change with regard to reducing risk with regard to ocean-borne shipments leaving the Persian Gulf. As you mentioned, I'm very familiar with this area. It's my favorite place in the world, to be sure, with regard to my 5 deployments there and the multiple dozens of times through the Strait of Hormuz. But the Iranians and the IRGC were not going to change. And I think on the strategic level, if you think about what they're trying to achieve by attacking Kuwait, by attacking Bahrain, they're also sending that signal that, and Arachi, I heard him today talk about, do not allow the United States to have their bases to attack the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they're using that as a pressure point to basically cause a recalculation, regardless of what the MOU says. Iran is the big dog. Iran is in charge of the Strait of Hormuz, and they're going to actually try to govern it. They've done it internally also with their politics.
Yeah.
One final point on the tanker attack. I thought the interesting oil tanker attack was the one that occurred yesterday between the tanker transit passage from Qatar down to the Emirates. Again, these are 2 Gulf cooperation countries. Secretary of State Rubio spent an enormous amount of time with the Gulf Cooperation Council states to look at the future of the new regime. So I think we need to have a Persian Gulf security regime that does not have Iran as a hegemon. And we need to think about what the president said. Maybe we don't have to have the IRGC or the Islamic Republic of Iran in governance, but that's going to take a lot of obviously regime thought going forward.
Very quickly, are there targets left to hit? I mean, the president says, there won't be an Iran left if we go back into bombing them.
I think there are. And I think if you look at some of the strategic targets the president mentioned, he held back on the electrical distribution, the water systems. There's some significant targets inside Iran. I think the CENTCOM planners, the CENTCOM intelligence has gotten better and better looking at these recent strikes where they hit a reconfigured drone launch area, command and control by the IRGC. There's about 25 different places where IRGC has command and control deep into the Persian Gulf, also outside the Persian Gulf, around Jask and Charbahar. They're also very dangerous going down the littoral area on the eastern side of the UAE. We need to have our fleet there. We do still have the 2 carrier battle groups there, the George Herbert Walker Bush, and as well as the Abraham Lincoln with its strike group. We've got ships also at the Red Sea. But more to be done. I think we need to be prepared for just this type of weekend. Thank you, John.
All right. Retired Navy Captain Bob Wells. Captain, thank you.
You're welcome.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.